But I think that as often is the case around the presidency and presidential campaigns, there's no Aaron Sorkin screenplay here. The people who think, oh, we just get somebody else and they're going to walk to the White House, that is complete BS.
We're going to go into why that's complete and utter BS after this. If you want to hear the real ways we're going to win this election, not some ridiculous fantasies, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. We really need subscribers, and ringling that dingling bell to get notifications on all of our latest videos. Now, we've been talking to grassroots activists on the Democratic side and seeing their activities online, and we have to say that one phrase has been repeated to us, or variations on it. Biden was there for us, and we're going to be there for Joe Biden. The grassroots is behind Joe Biden in this race. They were not derailed by a 90-minute performance on a debate stage. They know what a great president Joe Biden has been, and they know that there isn't another candidate that can achieve the things in office that Joe Biden did. So who is behind this? Well, let's be clear. First off, it is Republicans. It is Donald Trump supporters. And it's the tacit Donald Trump supporters. People like the New York Times editorial board, who has been working against the Joe Biden presidency and the Joe Biden candidacy from the beginning, and who has been letting Donald Trump get away with everything in the interim. And it's also a certain group of the Democrats. We know who these people are. You may not know, actually. This is that Axelrod crowd. These people were too cowardly to run a candidate in the primaries against Joe Biden. And so they've been sitting in the sidelines, kibitzing and throwing out this ridiculous scenario every time that Joe Biden stumbled, even in the slightest. And they are not doing this for the good of the party. They have insidious and craven reasons, which we will deal with later as to why they're doing this. So it's not Joe Biden's friends. Okay, if you hear someone saying the people behind replacing Joe Biden are his friends, it is not Joe Biden's friends. Now, very few people have looked at the process of replacing Joe Biden in any seriousness and with any detail. One of the few people who's done this is Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC. So we're going to use some of his statements and ideas behind this as jumping off points for our discussion. And we're going to start with what Lawrence O'Donnell said about the process and about the candidates.
The word panic started showing up on banners on your television screens. And then, of course, came the unrealistic notions that there is a magical candidate who can emerge to pick up the banner as the Democratic presidential nominee. Not one person who makes that suggestion has said who that magical candidate is and how and through what process the nomination could be delivered to that magical candidate. The New York Times editorial encouraging Joe Biden to leave the race, published tonight, at least admits, perhaps inadvertently at the end, that the New York Times doesn't have any idea how this should happen, because the editorial says the Democrats must, quote, create a process to select someone more capable to stand in his place to defeat Mr. Trump in November. Create a process, because the process does not exist. And there is no polling data to even begin to suggest that that candidate exists. There's no polling data.
So there is no polling data suggesting a candidate exists who could do better. And there is no process. And the New York Times, who we just talked about in the intro to this segment, they have no idea, because they're not serious about this. They're trying to undermine Joe Biden. Now, who does poll well? Who does poll well? Well, Lawrence had that to say about this.
The other Democrat, the only other Democrat to this day who has ever polled well against Donald Trump, the only Democrat who's polled strongly against Donald Trump, is Joe Biden. The second best polling candidate among Democrats against Donald Trump is actually Vice President Kamala Harris. The magical dream candidates are completely unknown to most people in the country, governors of states like California, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and not one of those governors polls anywhere close to Kamala Harris or Joe Biden against Donald Trump.
Not one of those candidates, not one of those candidates polls as well as Joe Biden or Kamala Harris against Donald Trump. I've actually heard people say that Donald Trump is a weak candidate, so almost anybody could beat him. Donald Trump is a weak person. He's morally weak, but he's not a weak candidate, I'm sad to say. So these candidates are completely unknown. They have never, these other candidates that are being mooted, these governors of big and small states, they have never run national campaigns. They have never been vetted. The Oppo research that's going to come out on them is going to make your head spin. And we've seen this just in the last year. We've heard, remember about a year, 2 years ago, people started talking about DeSantis and they were saying, oh, DeSantis, he's the person I'm really frightened of, not Donald Trump. And, we sat on the sideline and say, well, I got to see him on the national stage to see what kind of threat he is. And we saw him on the national stage and he was a complete and utter fizzle. And nobody talks about him. Not only, he's not in the conversation for VP and he's barely in the conversation for 2028. And who else did we see in the last year who blew up? Another small state governor, Kristi Noem. She was in the conversation for VP, but she had never really been on a national stage. She attempted to go on a national stage and thought, oh, advocating killing puppies is a way I'm going to endear myself with the public. Now, I doubt the Democrats will be stupid enough to advocate killing puppies, but they may make mistakes of equal proportion. And because they have no national experience and no national constituency, there's not going to be a huge desire to defend these people when they make huge mistakes or when a fact comes out about them that nobody has heard before. And that is just going to be going nonstop from now until Election Day. Now let's get back to the issue of the process. Now, there is no process to replace Joe Biden. There used to be a sort of a process. It was a terrible process. It was the smoke-filled room situation. And Lawrence O'Donnell is going to look at how that worked in the past.
One thoughtful essay about this process reminded us that this is the way Abraham Lincoln was chosen at the Republican convention in 1860. It took 3 long ballots to nominate Abraham Lincoln. You can expect the balloting at the Democratic convention in August to take at least 3 ballots, maybe more. And you can imagine what the press would say about the Democrats struggling to nominate a candidate and how much disarray they would figure into their reporting. You can hope that it's not a rerun of the 1924 Democratic Convention in New York City when it took 103 ballots to nominate John Davis, who went on to lose to Calvin Coolidge. That Democratic Convention lasted from June 24th to July 9th. 2 weeks to get a nominee who would lose. The last time the Democrats nominated a presidential candidate that way, he lost to Republican Richard Nixon. This is what that convention looked like in 1968 in Chicago, where there was violence in that convention hall and days of violence outside the convention hall, which was later described as a riot by the Chicago police against peaceful protesters by a commission that investigated the riots at the 1968 Democratic Convention, which ended up nominating Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who then went on to lose because that's what happens after violent conventions like that. The Democratic Convention in Chicago is in Chicago again this year. And as it happens, the magic number of delegates for winning the presidential nomination is 1968, 1,968. There are going to be protesters. There always are. Usually they are not violent. This year there will definitely be protesters supporting Israel, and there will definitely be protesters supporting Palestinians. The television cameras will be trained on those protesters more than on delegates. The longer the convention goes on, trying to find a nominee, the messier it could get in Chicago. The modern, orderly convention that is really our television shows produced by the party last 4 days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And Thursday night, in prime time, is always the triumphant speech by the nominee. But at a contested convention, we have no idea what Thursday night might bring. Politically, throwing the nomination open in a contested convention is a step into the unknown.
It is a step into the unknown. And it could go disastrously wrong. It is likely to go disastrously wrong. But even more important than that is a simple fact. One of the main reasons people are supporting Joe Biden and the Democrats is because Donald Trump tried to overthrow the will of the voters. We all know this, right? He tried to overthrow the will of the voters on January 6th. So how can we as a party attempt to overthrow the will of our voters who voted in overwhelming numbers for Joe Biden in the primaries? Millions upon millions of Democrats voted for Joe Biden in the primaries. And let me just say, these people were voting for Joe Biden despite the fact that it was largely uncontested, and nobody in any significant numbers. There were other candidates. There were other ways to express disappointment, and they did not do that. Joe Biden was winning with 90% of the vote in most of these primaries. People got in their cars, drove to a polling place to vote for Joe Biden when Joe Biden was going to be the nominee regardless. And we are going to subvert the wishes of those millions of people the way Donald Trump did on January 6th with an untried process that is likely to be chaotic, that is likely to be discussed as Democrats in disarray, one of the media's favorite phrases and favorite ways to cover the Democrats. We are really going to go through with that process. Plus, remember, this is the GOP conspiracy. This is what the GOP for years have been saying we were going to do, that we weren't really going to run Joe Biden, that at the last minute we were going to replace him. So think of the field day Fox News will have with this process. And think of how it backs up their claims of the deep state, that the secret cabal of delegates somewhere, sometime, is choosing a candidate that no voter voted for. Imagine how that's going to go. And then let's discuss something that nobody has discussed, including Lawrence O'Donnell. They're also going to have to pick a vice president. So it's definitely going to go beyond 4 days. And I don't know if they're going to do it through a voting process like this. Likely they're going to allow the candidate to select the vice president. The vice president, then he's going to have to be nominated. And the vice president is going to face the same kind of scrutiny, vice presidential candidate, that the candidate does. The Oppo research. And vice presidents have derailed campaigns in the past. Remember, in 1972, some of you may not know this, there was a disaster with McGovern, a long shot at best. He completely eliminated any chance he had for the White House through a disastrous pick of Senator Eagleton, who had to then be replaced You can look into your history on that. More recently, of course, McCain's picking of Sarah Palin, which initially looked like it might be a smart decision and eventually backfired. Many people feel that McCain lost enough female Republicans to lose that race. But we don't need to look at what happens, in the aggregate. We can see exactly how the Republicans reacted when this happened in 1968.
One thoughtful essay that has worked through this scenario suggests it would be very exciting TV for the first time at a political convention. That means for the first time since 1968, when you could watch the rioting live on TV during the convention, sometimes in split screens that showed the protesters being beaten in the streets by the Chicago police while the Chicago political machine's henchmen were beating up reporters in the convention hall. Exciting is one word you could use for that kind of TV. It was also horrifying. The Republican nominee for president, Richard Nixon, was watching the Democratic convention on TV, and that is when he knew he was going to win in November.
And Donald Trump will be doing just the same thing, except Donald Trump will have been doing something the minute that Joe Biden pulls out, bows out, as they say, gracefully bows out. He will declare victory. He will say the Democrats can't even win one debate. He will say they're going to trot out everyone and their sister, and he will say he is the Kingslayer. And that is a campaign that works. That campaign works every day and twice on Sundays. And it will immediately demean the candidate, who will be demeaned by the process itself. But there's an issue that nobody is talking about, an issue of vast importance that Lawrence O'Donnell makes very clear. And it's at the linchpin of winning the election in the fall.
Here's the part of the story that no one who has said Joe Biden should drop out or has written that Joe Biden should drop out has ever mentioned, that every other Democrat whose name shows up in these articles as a substitute for Joe Biden, as the Democratic nominee, has raised exactly zero money for a presidential campaign. No one has told you about the money. That means none of them have thought for a second about the money. Every serious observer of presidential campaigns is supposed to know how important campaign money is, and not one of these people who are telling you it's time to get rid of Joe Biden seem to have given a thought to the money. So here's what they haven't told you or simply do not know. Not one penny Gavin Newsom has in his campaign treasury in California is usable in a presidential campaign. Money raised for statewide elections of governors in California and other states is raised under different laws than the laws governing federal campaign money. So Gavin Newsom has zero to spend on a presidential campaign as of tonight, and Gavin Newsom knows that. And Gavin Newsom, if he can get the nomination, would then leave the convention with no ability to even fly his way home. So let me say that number again, zero. That's how many dollars Gavin Newsom would have to spend on a presidential campaign, leaving the Democratic convention. He'd have zero.
Let's reiterate that. Zero. Leaving Chicago, that ticket would have zero money. This is August. This will be August while everyone is on vacation. This unknown ticket will have to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. Hundreds of millions of dollars. While they're fighting off all the oppo, all the negative press, all the Democrats in disarray discussion, they will have to spend hours every day on the phone raising money from dubious donors who are going to watch this process in shock and disgust because they were not prepared for what this was going to look like and are not going to want to part with their money. And meanwhile, this gets at another point with the Axelrod crowd that we suggested we were going to bring up. This is the real reason why the Axelrod crowd has been pushing for this. People who work on campaigns, campaign managers, and those sorts of people, they make a lot of money. They're still pissed off that Joe Biden got the nomination with so little money. People may forget this, but he had no money. He used very little money. He locked up the nomination fairly rapidly, despite a slow start. And so all those people who were running on the other campaigns didn't get to make the kind of money they had in previous cycles. And many of those people thought that, based on misunderstandings of things that Joe Biden said, that 2024 was going to be an open primary and they were going to make tons of money. These people, let me reiterate, they do not care about you. They do not care about the Democratic Party. And that's why these people were not allowed in Biden world. Now, there is a candidate that could make a claim on the money. And let's look at who that is.
There is one other candidate besides Joe Biden who has raised money for a presidential campaign, and that only that one candidate who's done that is Kamala Harris.
Yes. She has a claim on the money because the money that has been raised is in the name of the Biden-Harris ticket. But let me reiterate, that is a claim. It has never happened before. A vice president has never taken over a campaign and used the money. And trust me, the GOP will be in court faster than it can make your head spin fighting this issue. And looking at what the kind of support they have in the court system right now, there's a good chance that they would win on that. And either the money can't be used, or they have to pay back that money. Or even worse, you have a potential president facing felony campaign violations as they enter office, if they happen to even win that office. And let's look at, and we don't even have to make up what could happen in a situation where a candidate doesn't have the money, doesn't have the time, doesn't have the vetting. Because this happened before.
Hubert Humphrey lost that election to Republican Richard Nixon by less than 1% of the vote, and the Humphrey campaign quite reasonably blamed their loss on not being able to raise enough money in so short a time and not having enough time to build a presidential campaign around a candidate who was forced to enter the race so late and not run in a single primary.
Yes. That's what he said. Humphrey lost because he entered the race late and couldn't raise enough money. He entered the race late and couldn't raise enough money. So what have we learned? That is exactly the situation any replacement to Joe Biden would be in. And there's another issue that we haven't discussed yet. A convention like this is going to cause schisms. If Kamala Harris is not chosen, that's going to cause a schism. If there's more than one candidate, there's going to be people on one side and people on another side, and that's going to cause a schism. And this also has happened before.
Most of her most ardent supporters would, I'm sure, in the end, on Election Day, find their way to voting against Donald Trump. But that's not what happened in 1968. In 1968, enough voters who supported the anti-Vietnam War candidate, Senator Gene McCarthy, at the 1968 convention, left that convention so embittered by what they saw as Hubert Humphrey stealing the nomination Hubert Humphrey did not run in a single primary, and Gene McCarthy heroically did run and did win primaries. Enough primaries that McCarthy voters angrily then stayed home in November. And Richard Nixon won the presidency by 1% of the vote.
Voters will stay home in November. Now, who will those voters be? It might be people who caused a rift at the convention. It could be many of those people who got in their cars and went to primaries across the country and voted for Joe Biden. It could be Kamala Harris supporters when Kamala Harris isn't chosen, because the people who are behind this dump Biden movement do not like Kamala Harris. They may dislike Kamala Harris even more than Joe Biden. So there you go. That really tells you the situation we're in. And this kind of panic has happened before. Let's look at that.
I heard this talk once before on the Democratic side in 1992, at exactly this point in the on the calendar in June, when Bill Clinton was running third at a tiny 25% of the vote against Ross Perot's leading 39% and President George H.W. Bush's 31%. And there was panic in the halls of Congress about that, where I was working at the time. There was much talk of trying to replace Bill Clinton as the nominee, even though he had the nomination locked up through the primaries. There was talk of somehow getting Mario Cuomo, the governor of New York, who already refused to run for president that year, to take the nomination somehow away from Bill Clinton. Or George Mitchell, then majority leader of the United States Senate. And I knew George Mitchell and worked with George Mitchell in those days. And I knew that that talk about George Mitchell was preposterous. George Mitchell knew it was preposterous. And it was being pushed by other members of Congress, including senators, who knew absolutely nothing about the complexity of running a presidential campaign. They were all dreaming about something none of them knew how to do. And in the end, all that panic was for nothing. Bill Clinton won. He won with 43% of the vote.
Bill Clinton won with 43% of the vote. And we think Joe Biden will win with, 50 point something percent of the vote, or maybe even more. And in conclusion, this is what Lawrence O'Donnell has to say. And we're going to be back after this with our own concluding statements.
The money raised for the Biden-Harris campaign has been raised in the name of both candidates. So Kamala Harris has a legal claim on all of that money if Joe Biden were to drop out of the race. All the imagined contested Democratic convention candidates there would only be one candidate, Kamala Harris, who would actually have real money for a presidential campaign. And that might be decisive. That might get her the nomination in this scenario at the convention after who knows how many ballots. But at least Kamala Harris could leave the convention with real money to spend on a presidential campaign, and no one else could. So when someone tells you Biden should drop out, immediately ask them who the candidate should be, then ask how that candidate can get the nomination, on how many ballots, and then ask the question that you know has never passed through their minds: what about the money? And if they can't answer all of those questions to your satisfaction, you are not talking to someone with a solution.
You're not talking to someone with a solution, and you're not talking to a serious person. And most of these people who are proposing the dump Biden are not serious people, and they're not serious Democrats. And I think we've shown in this video that this process, which may look like a solution, is anything but a solution. And that our best course forward is to stick with Joe Biden, to deal with the issue as you do in all campaigns, and to fight. We knew this was going to be a fight from the beginning. We knew this was going to be hard. But Joe Biden is our best chance to win, and Joe Biden is our best chance to have a presidency over the next 4 years that gets things accomplished. If you liked this video, and I know it was a little long, make sure to subscribe, but also donate. We're operating on a shoestring with a skeleton crew, and we could really use your help.